The pyramids of Giza were not built to be admired. They were built to be feared, silent proof that the king who commanded them was not a man but a living god, whose word could move 10,000 tons of stone across a desert. For 400 years, that illusion held Egypt together. Then, almost overnight, it shattered. The Nile itself seemed to turn against the pharaohs. The floods that fed 60 generations of harvests failed, year after year, decade after decade. Granaries emptied. Governors who once knelt before the king began building their own tombs, minting their own titles, feeding their own people while the capital starved. In the space of a single long reign, the most powerful state on earth dissolved into 100 rival principalities, and the god-king who was supposed to hold back chaos discovered he could not even feed his own household. This is the story of what came after the Age of Pyramids. Not decline as an ending, but collapse as the opening chapter of a longer, stranger Egyptian story that the monuments never tell. By the 24th century BCE, Egypt had already been a unified kingdom for 700 years, and for the last 100 of them, its kings had been raising stone mountains against the sky. The pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure at Giza were the products of a state that could organize, feed, and house tens of thousands of laborers for decades at a time, that could quarry granite in Aswan and float it 1,000 kilometers downriver, that could command the loyalty of every province in the Nile Valley without a standing army large enough to enforce it by force alone. The pharaoh's authority rested on something more fragile than soldiers, a shared belief that he was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the guarantor of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the sun rising, the Nile flooding, and the harvest coming in. As long as the flood came and the granaries filled, no one questioned whether the king was truly divine. The moment the flood failed, everyone did. The warning signs appeared gradually, then all at once. Egypt's kings of the 5th and 6th dynasties had begun to distribute more and more power to provincial governors, the nomarchs, granting them hereditary control over their districts in exchange for loyalty and tax revenue. It was, in the short term, an efficient way to administer a kingdom 800 miles long with Bronze Age technology. In the long term, it created a class of regional lords who owed their wealth to their own land and their own irrigation works, not to the pharaoh's largesse. When King Pepi II ascended the throne as a young child, later tradition claimed he ruled for over 90 years, a figure modern historians treat with caution. The central government's grip loosened further with every decade of a long, aging reign. Court officials wielded power an absent or elderly king could not. Meanwhile, something even the pharaoh could not command was quietly turning against Egypt: the climate. Modern paleoclimatology, using sediment cores and pollen records from the Nile Delta and equatorial Africa, points to a period of severe, sustained aridification across northeastern Africa beginning around 2200 BCE. A phenomenon some researchers connect to a broader era of abrupt climate change recorded as far away as Mesopotamia, where it coincides with the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. The annual Nile flood, on which every aspect of Egyptian agriculture depended, is believed to have weakened dramatically for a period of decades. A flood that rose too low left fields unwatered. A flood that failed to recede in time drowned the planting season. Egyptian records from the following century speak of famine in language usually reserved for cosmic catastrophe, because to the people living through it, that is exactly what it was. Ma'at, the order of the universe, was failing, and the king who was supposed to prevent that failure had no answer. What followed is known to Egyptologists as the First Intermediate Period, a term that itself reveals a bias. It defines this era only by what came before and after it, the Old and Middle Kingdoms, as though the century and a half in between were merely an embarrassing gap. But for the people who lived through it, this was not an interval. It was their entire lives. The unified state fractured into competing power centers. In the south, the city of Thebes, then a minor provincial town, rose in influence under a line of local rulers. In the north, a rival dynasty based at Heracleopolis claimed the old royal titles and, for a time, at least nominal control over Memphis and the traditional seat of kingship. Between them lay a patchwork of nomarchs who governed as effectively independent rulers, some genuinely trying to protect their people from famine, others exploiting the chaos for personal gain. The tomb inscriptions of provincial governors from this era offer an unusually candid, almost boastful record of crisis management. A nomarch named Antifi, ruling the district of Hierakonpolis in the south, left an inscription describing a famine so severe that he claims all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, to the point that people were eating their own children. A hyperbolic claim, scholars caution, more rhetorical than literal, but revealing of the scale of the trauma being described. Antifi presents himself not as a subordinate of any king but as a savior in his own right, distributing grain, defending his district's borders, and negotiating or fighting with his neighbors as an independent power. This is a strikingly different kind of self-presentation from the god-kings of the Pyramid Age. Legitimacy was no longer descending from a divine pharaoh. It was being built from the ground up, district by district, granary by granary, by whichever local leader could actually keep his people fed. This redistribution of authority produced, alongside genuine suffering, an unexpected cultural flowering. Without a single royal court monopolizing patronage and monumental building, artistic and literary traditions that had once been confined to the palace began appearing in provincial tombs across Egypt. Funerary texts that had been the exclusive property of kings in the pyramid-building era, spells guaranteeing safe passage into the afterlife, began to be adapted for use by regional officials and eventually a wider swath of the elite, a process scholars call the democratization of the afterlife. It is not that ordinary Egyptians could suddenly afford elaborate burials. Access remained tied to wealth and status. But the theological monopoly of kingship had cracked, and with it, the assumption that only a pharaoh's soul mattered enough to merit eternity. Literature from this period, or literature set in this period and composed slightly later to reflect on it, captures a mood of anxiety unlike anything in the confident inscriptions of the pyramid builders. A text known to modern scholars as the Admonitions of Epure describes a world turned upside down. Rivers run with blood, the poor have become rich and the rich destitute, tombs are robbed, and the very structure of Ma'at seems to have inverted itself. Egyptologists debate whether this text describes real events of the first intermediate period or was composed later as a kind of moral warning, a genre exercise in imagining chaos to justify the restored order that followed. A caution worth stating plainly, since the text has sometimes been mistaken for straightforward reportage rather than literary reflection. Either way, it reflects something real. The collapse of centralized pharaonic Egypt was remembered, whether experienced firsthand or recalled through later eyes, as a genuine trauma, a rupture in the natural order severe enough to require its own literature of grief. The political fragmentation was not merely regional squabbling. It hardened, for a time, into open civil war. The Heracleopolitan kings of the north and the Theban rulers of the south fought for control of Middle Egypt for generations, in a conflict whose details survive only in fragments. A few royal names, a handful of tomb biographies from soldiers who served one side or the other, the archaeological evidence of destroyed towns along the contested frontier near Abydos. It was, in miniature, a preview of a pattern that would recur throughout later Egyptian history. Whenever central authority weakened, the country tended to split roughly along the ancient fault line between the Nile Delta and the Nile Valley, between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, the same division the earliest pharaohs had claimed to unite 3,000 years, at that point roughly 800 years before. The war was eventually decided not by Memphis, the ancient capital, nor by Heracleopolis, the northern rival, but by Thebes, a town that had been a provincial backwater at the start of the Old Kingdom. Around 2055 BCE, a Theban ruler named Mentuhotep II succeeded where generations of his predecessors had failed, defeating the Heracleopolitan kingdom and reuniting Egypt under a single crown for the first time in over a century. Later Egyptian king lists would remember him as the founder of a new age, and modern historians mark his reunification as the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. But what makes Mentuhotep's achievement significant is not simply that he restored a map. It's that the kingdom he restored was, by necessity, a different kind of state than the one that had built the pyramids. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom inherited a hard lesson their pyramid-building ancestors never had to learn. Absolute claims to divine kingship were not, by themselves, sufficient to hold a kingdom together through genuine crisis. Mentuhotep and his successors could not simply declare themselves living gods and expect blind loyalty from provincial governors who had spent 100 years ruling their own territories, feeding their own people, and, in some cases, fighting off royal armies. The new kings had to actively rebuild the machinery of centralized government, reasserting control over regional administration, restoring the irrigation and granary systems that had failed during the crisis, and, crucially, reconstructing royal ideology itself. Middle Kingdom kingship literature, quite unlike the serene confidence of Old Kingdom pyramid texts, is full of anxious meditation on the responsibilities of the king, on the fragility of order, and on the possibility that Maat could fail again if the ruler did not actively work to maintain it. One instructional text attributed to the era, addressed from a king to his heir, is startlingly candid about the loneliness and danger of rule, warning the young prince to trust no one completely, not even his own family. This shift from kingship as an unquestioned cosmic fact to kingship as an active, precarious achievement that had to be earned and defended is, in many ways, the single most important legacy of Egypt's first great collapse. It would shape everything that followed. The ambitious frontier fortifications the Middle Kingdom built in Nubia to secure its southern border and its access to gold and trade routes into Africa. The careful royal propaganda campaigns designed to erase the memory of a fractured Egypt and present the Middle Kingdom as an unbroken continuation of pharaonic glory, and, eventually, the vulnerabilities that would open the door to Egypt's next great crisis, when a foreign power would do what climate and civil war alone could not, and seize the Egyptian throne itself. But that catastrophe, and the empire that would rise from its ashes, belongs to the next chapter of this story, because the fall of the god kings, as devastating as it was only the first time Egypt would have to learn how to rebuild itself. But reunification was not the end of Egypt's story. It was the beginning of an empire's rise, and the first cracks of the crisis that would one day bring it down again.